fud sin táiseach an dráasta agus sé tlach thobhód a ham Matt Zurowski a bhí son seminar a chuiscéin an dú. Sin neachhealainn a hán an Matt agus ha fudach an dunéidean ach ha má sé féidirna óridíchan a hagin a ha cuideoch na olanoch ag somorostek, agus tá sin hopráisiil go bhfuil sin a gobar le duine ha ag go bhfuil is Gaelic agus ag go bhfuil an slú cho aontínoch. So Matt's a sound artist and a musician and a video artist, performance installation, and he's worked across a whole variety of these areas. But he's also really interested in Scottish Gaelic and is working through the course of Urtish and Drasta. So Hanilism be Gaelic my first Genora be a part of my first Genachusper, a bit of brain ring me in and due. He's working on a PhD at the moment at the Edinburgh College of Art, where he's co-supervised by Donald Lim Stewart here at Somorostig, bringing together ideas about Scottish Gaelic literature, folklore and oral tradition with his work and his interests in sonic and moving image and performance-based artworks. And he's got a huge interest in piping and in drones, and I think that's going to come through in what he's going to talk to us about today, but also he's going to be thinking about the ways in which his interest in poetry, folklore can feed into the kinds of creative practice work that he's doing now. Sé clach go haun go bhfuil luchhealainn san luchgéisteach agus ha mín dóchas gan bí sin táirseach córa gomainn sin go bhana sin sin ní cinna hagin mar závis do a ha sin coite cuspar an car an chirim ach fagi me sin yeah Matt. I'll leave that to Matt to start, and falshort Matt Homa thinking agus we're all looking forward to hearing about your work and about your project and to the next wee while where you're giving us an introduction to all of them.
Well, tang rit Abby. Dulik genial Gaelic jaar agam haast as Abby said, you know, Giro gaan model aga then curse erstis anish. Ach, yeah, I'll stick to the English today. Maybe there'll be a chance further down the line for another presentation, and I'll have a bit more Gaelic with me by then. Anyway, so yeah, I'm Matt Zurowski, based in Edinburgh, and as Abby says, I like to categorize myself as a musician who used to want to be an artist, who's now an artist who wants to be a musician. So there's this constant kind of dialogue in my work between sound, listening, music. And yeah, at the moment, my focus is very much on Scottish Gaelic culture, which comes through in the PhD. And I'm going to speak a bit broadly about my my research today, and then focus in on a recent work that I've kind of been. It feels like a bit of a behemoth that's kind of constantly growing and changing and moving around. But that's the Waterfall Laments, which is based on Iain Dall MacAoidh's Cumha Choire and Easa. So I'm really interested in how artistic methods can disrupt anthropocentrism in the light of environmental change nowadays. And I take a sort of practice-based inquiry that draws on new materialism, sonic studies, and aspects of traditional ecological knowledge to generate work that responds to the natural environment of Scotland, specifically in relation to the Gaelic-speaking regions of Scotland, and also the histories of these sites. So, Emptied Lands in Other Worlds, that's the title of my PhD. I'm really interested in the ontological and epistemological dimensions of Scottish Gaelic folklore and culture, and how they express ideas that are similar to philosophies that I was originally kind of interested in from the fields of new materialism in relation to traditional ecological knowledge, i.e. kind of the environmental knowledge that gets handed down predominantly through oral cultures. And yeah, that's the kind of impetus for my research. What I didn't necessarily expect to become such an integral part, and I'll speak about it later on. Although I thought learning Gaelic would enable me to speak the language better, to understand the language better, but also just, you know, sitting and practicing words practicing certain sounds in the mouth and finding relationships between different sort of performance styles or different aspects of, say, animal mimicry and the like. So yeah, there's this kind of constant. I feel as though I'm a professional dilettante sometimes, kind of trying a bit of this, trying a bit of that, and attempting to bring all these things together, and hope that in the middle, there's in the middle of all these kind of floating ideas, there's an interesting island emerging. I suppose that's what the PhD is. So yeah, exploring the eco-poetics of Scottish Gaelic folklore in the Anthropocene. A bit of housekeeping. Anthropocene is a geophysical term that's used to define the current epoch in which human activity has become the dominant influence on our planet's environment. So I'm really interested, as I said before, in philosophies of new materialism, thinkers like Timothy Morton, Donna Haraway, and Bruno Latour, who have sought to redress the nature-culture divide and have emphasized the importance of attending to the entangled ecologies of human and non-human, mountain and spirit, and sediment and sentiment, which I think is a great quote from Bruno Latour. I'm really interested in how these approaches echo what Alistair McIntosh has termed the green spiritual consciousness of Scottish Gaelic folklore. I find the word green is becoming increasingly problematized, associated with kind of greenwashing, but I think there's still something interesting in the fact that Gaelic's an ancient language, and it's used to navigate, to name, to engage with, to understand, to hear the land in a really unique and situated manner. So eco-poetics and eco-poetry, I'm just going to kind of delineate those two things off the bat. So eco-poetry being more the poetry that is written to engage with ecological themes, whereas eco-poetics, I think of as something that's broader, that can shape relationships between language, between environments, between and really enables us to kind of think ecologically, so we can take an eco-poetic approach to pre-existing eco-poems as opposed to writing new eco-poetry. And yeah, through this kind of lens, I suppose I'm interested in how eco-criticism might be employed. And here, Gary Mackenzie, whose eco-poetic translation of Ben Doran by Donach Ban is really a fascinating and a very inspirational work to me and to my own research project. It kind of brings together a lot of these ideas that I've just kind of raised there, drawing on the object-oriented philosopher Graham Harman to kind of conceive of the poem as something which is constantly emergent, something that's not necessarily like fixed, but is kind of producing new ecologies through its emergence, both as in performance and in writing. Continuing along the line of eco-criticism, Patsy Callahan writes this, myths as a genre often invite us to read around the spaces of protagonists by giving the natural world itself agency, identity, and complexity. In this way, our most ancient stories, read eco-critically, can provide an antidote to the anthropocentrism that might be said to motivate, perpetuate, and aggravate the ecological crises of our time. So I'm really interested in the notion that taking this kind of approach to poetry and more broadly the poetics of, say, folklore might offer us ways of responding to environmental issues. I'm not interested in solving environmental issues. I don't think I can do that with bagpipes and a tape machine, but I do think it's an interesting way to start to reconceive how we position ourselves in relation to the natural environment in a time of environmental change. So, methods. Like I said, the musician-artist dichotomy, friction, however you want to see that. Prior to doing the PhD, I spent some time on a residency at Talbot Rice Gallery and had well, that's kind of what led to the PhD, because I got to spend some time working with the School of Scottish Studies archives there, speaking to people like the technician Stuart, who was working there at the time. As a musician, I've got a sort of analog fetish. I really like old technology. I like the kind of vibrancy of the materials, the fact that you can really hear the tactility of tape and the breaking down of tape in time. So I was really interested when engaging with the archives, how certain machines in the archives were used, created specifically for the purpose of archivists. So here on the left, we've got a looper that was originally used as a translation aid, which just reminded me of, I mean, around the same time that a lot of the field work was going on in Scotland, you had the emergence of like dub music over in Jamaica. It's the same technology that was used to kind of create plays. There's a dialogue between materials, between processes of documentation that I found really exciting. And yeah, that's all kind of threaded together with tape, which got coming out of my ears, but so long as the cat's not eating it, I'm doing okay. So yeah, tape is inherently unstable and mutable as well. It breaks down in time. It doesn't always preserve well. And it kind of as a method of capturing aspects of oral culture, which is mutable in its own right, I was kind of interested in how these kind of layers of mutability might be engaged and explored through making art and through making music. A really good example of someone who explores that would be someone like William Basinski, whose Disintegration Loops was basically a series of tape loops that he made in the 80s and then unearthed in the early thousands or late 90s, and then started playing them back. And as they went around the reel to reel, the layer of magnetic material on the reel that the sound stored on broke down and degraded over time. So you get to hear the sound of the tape basically disappearing. Closer to home, there's a very good recording or interesting recording on Calmaruach, Bhàrd of Skye. At the end, there's a composition that Thorkild Knudson's kind of put together a variety of different songs in a way to try and explore that mutability. So he's got like basically different versions of a song sung by Calmaruach, and he's kind of place them all on top of each other to try and produce this kind of dialogue that expresses that instability and mutability of tradition. So talking about tapes, I thought I'd go back and have a quick look at some of my older works before I move on to the Waterfall Laments. So this is a work called Eadar, which was basically, I had no Gaelic at all except Duolingo Gaelic at the time. So I thought, how am I going to engage with the language? I'll go for the silences between words. And I was very interested in this process of EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, which paranormal investigators would use to kind of listen to, say, like, you know, if you tune into white noise on the radio, and then you can hear the spirits or you can hear voices, different patterns. I thought, what if we could turn that into the archive? And so I kind of started thinking about ways that I might approach that, and had a really interest in how you might listen to recordings of people describing encounters with Nishian as a way of kind of attending to supernatural presence in the archives. So this, along with some video that was taken around a ferry knoll in Argyll, constitutes Eadar. So it's quite a short video, but a good idea. Hear that, okay. I noticed there at the time I had a real interest in the work of the cinema filmmaker Mark Jenkin, and had the camera plans that I was doing it with like an old Super 8, so you can kind of push the side and it does this amazing zoom. And I was talking to Abby before we started there about the fact that I love the fact that the camera zooms in on your faces as you talk in the room. So there's a link. Yeah, and then after starting the PhD, so that was pre-PhD. After starting the PhD, the kind of first substantial work that I made was Farewell to the Familiar Earth, Beanach, Leis, and eadar-theangachadh, which was basically positioned around clearance poetry. I was really interested in how the nettle came to be a symbol for loss in the wake of the clearances, along with bracken, and kind of undertook a variety of research in how the nettle was understood in medicinal contexts, so through the lens of traditional ecological knowledge, which led me down the garden path, looking at old medical manuscripts and tracts and reading about the beatings, and yeah, really interesting stuff. But at the heart of it, took two poems, one Nuaimh and then an ath-obrachadh as well, which both deal with the symbol of the nettle. And I applied, so going back to the earlier conversation I was having about William Basinski, I started trying to force tapes to decay in order to try and represent this sort of change and decay in the archive as a way of kind of trying to think about how I might take these recordings and kind of edit them with the materials that are used to kind of archive them in the first place. Yeah, again, these kind of interests in ontology and epistemology, how we situate ourselves in relation to belief and the natural world, kind of running through everything here. I'll move on and show you a wee video from this. So this was made using the tape technique I just described, and then also the three images are of nettles, but they were developed in the nettles. So I found there's a really interesting group of photographers called the Sustainable Darkroom, and they work with kind of various materials to try and make non-toxic developers. And nettles was, and I can't remember if they had done nettles, they'd done a lot of work with seaweed. Basically, if something's high in sort of phenolic compounds, like instant coffee is really high in it, so you can do caffeinol developing. But here, I thought it'd be interesting to try and get the nettles to develop themselves. And in doing so, I kind of also started from a place of looking at chaidh and old recipes in the McLagan manuscripts to try and essentially repurpose or misuse objects from the archive or recipes from the archive to produce artworks. So yeah, the sound is from, I think it's an edit and a loop of some of the piano playing from a recording of Zurowski singing an ath-obrachadh, but it becomes quite abstract when you start kind of zooming in. But that's just for your own context there. I'll play it now. Stop it there because I'm conscious time's marching on and we had some technical issues at the start. So skip through that for the time being. So when thinking with sound, I've become really interested in the work of Stephen Feld recently, who is a sound theorist, and he terms himself rather than an ethnomusicologist, he thinks of himself as an eco-musicologist. But Feld has some very interesting ideas about how we acquire knowledge through listening and through sound. In his fieldwork, he observed that the Kaluli people of the Basavi Forest in Papua New Guinea had a sophisticated understanding and appreciation of their sound-rich environment. and that sound was central to making sense, to knowing, and to experiential truth. So for the Kaluli, sound is bound up in notions of place and placement, but also integrated into local cosmology, poetry, song, the past, the present, and the future of the place. He coined this term acoustemology, which I've become very attached to, perhaps unhealthily so. But it conjoins acoustics and epistemology to theorize a way of knowing, and in doing so inquires into what is knowable and what becomes known through sounding and through listening. He has another description of acoustemology, though, which is perhaps more productive and direct, which is listening to histories of listening. And I kind of feel like that's what you do in an oral culture. You're listening to histories of listening and you're acquiring knowledge through listening. So acoustemology invites us to listen to sites, but also to listen with sites, attending to the cultural histories and stories embedded within them, engaging with both human and modern histories through sound. So upon kind of getting interested in acoustemology, I started to think how listening practices function in the Gaeltacht, how they're explained in folklore, in belief systems, and in the language itself. And started by looking at Ghàidhlig for various forms of auditory perception. So perhaps expanding on some of the earlier work that I'd done with trying to listen between words for the presence of Nishian. Yeah, and these are some examples of auditory experiences with the supernatural from the Gaelic otherworld. So fundamentally, there is a bleed between worlds, and I thought that Kristen Gallerno, who's a sort of sound theorist in the States, had a really interesting way of putting this, in that in choosing to listen to a subject, one becomes almost as ghostly as the thing in itself. She's kind of interested in the fact that we can listen to the beyond and listen to non-normative realities, but perhaps most interestingly, she's not really worried about whether you believe or don't believe in the presence of spirits or the lack of the presence of spirits, because the other world has an impact on the imaginary. It produces real world connections. It produces it threads its way through creativity, through listening practices, and through the natural environment in an interesting way. And I was reminded in Kristen Gallerno's work of a quote from John McInnes, where he talks about the fairy knoll as a metaphor for imagination, and how he said that a friend said to him, so he'd kind of been in the hill since he learned this music or a story that he then passed on that McInnes hadn't heard before. Additionally, as well as in the sort of supernatural auditioning of the Chluas no, sorry, in Ghàidhlig, we also have a Chluas where where the which I suppose is associated with warnings, especially with regards to pìobareachd. We hear references to it with regards to Chola and also Nannig whereby the words of the tune can kind of be discerned through the melody, therefore a warning can be discerned through the melody of a song. So with both of these cases, I was really interested in how these different forms of attention and listening, which already exist in Gaelic folklore, might be kind of methodologically applied in the production and creation of works, or whether they could be. I was reminded of the work of Alex Finlay and Chris Watson, whose Cairngorm's Fauna Jukebox kind of reactivated acoustic ecologies by taking recordings of basically Finlay had gone around the Cairngorms and found place names which were named after animals that are no longer in the Cairngorms or in that area. And then Chris Watson, who's a sound recordist, took various recordings of these animals and played them out in the space. So we kind of reactivated these acoustic ecologies in a really interesting and sort of nuanced way. And yeah, with regards to Chluaisceil, these tunes being warnings was kind of interesting to me. It feels on the nose to suggest that we kind of are hearing warnings with regards to climate change, but I was reminded of, and we'll come to talk a little bit about in David later on, but in on the Isle of Rum, you know, in 2011, there was a study that showed that the rutting season was coming forward as a result of climate change. So these acoustic spaces that we perhaps take for granted in the landscape are changing sonically as well as you know, visually. So yeah, perhaps there's a warning in that that's kind of slowly making its way in. I'll move forward and start talking about this. So this is the Waterfall Laments, which is the most recent kind of research outcome that I've been working on. It itself is mutable. I did a performance of it earlier this year, and I've kind of been chopping and changing bits of it since then. I'm going to play a little bit of the first part of the performance here. So that's the start of it, at least in its current state. The sound at the end after bhn is the sound of one of my bagpipe drones, and I'm not sure, I bought a set of small pipes earlier this year, so I've been playing since about January. And when I bought the small pipes, none of the drones were working, so I had to start making my own reeds, which has been a great and interesting project. I like getting hands-on with these things. And I'm not sure whether it's because my reeds aren't that good, but if I apply very little pressure, I get this kind of sound that imitates the sound of it, the stag drum. So kind of interested in how mimicry might also cross between these technologies and the environment, and I'll come to bird mimicry a bit later on. But yeah, and also all as I'm sure was evident, all the adjectives there were basically the sounding adjectives from Cumha Choire and Easa, just lined up and said one after another. So, Cumha Choire, yes, a bit of historical context was written by Pìobaire Dall, Iain Dall MacAoidh, who is perhaps the only well-known piper poet in the Gaelic oral tradition. Linking him to the other world, you've got this example of the man being blinded by two banshees, and how he was given the chanter as a, and I suppose this is, well, given the chanter as a sort of recompense, but I suppose this is a fairly common story with regard to piping, and another reason why the questions of the other world keep coming up in relation to these developing works is there is a kind of consistent crossing over between pipers and gifts from Sheehan. Yes, he was taught by the McCrimmons, and yeah, although he was realistically a victim of smallpox, it's interesting to see his skill kind of transferred into this supernatural register here. Cumha Choire and Easa itself is an early pibroch poem, also an early example of nature poetry. Not that there wasn't poetry dealing with nature prior to it, but certainly it being a poem about nature, it's pretty early on, pretty interesting as that. It's very adjective heavy at the end, which we'll come to in a bit, and the structure of the poem altogether seems to be, it moves through a koa at the start. There's a moment where the piper is asked to play by the choire, and then at the end there's a praise poem, what John McInnes terms a fairly standard piece of nature panegyric. The poem takes the form of the dialogue between the piper slash poet and the choire, and that was kind of what initially took my interest, this like animistic aspect of the poem. I'm going to play a bit part 2 here.
Fagan na tíad a hiúna friad a léitih sé gagan ar a géad má fóca ceam stóris fón a léicu. Dúil seach brain altain diavich giarig bialoch na féhe far an bíd afjarag na chroica meil rodri dals an dave. Giarig bialoch an Easa far an trí cascapach fúder far an bí mil choing in chair verst cúd mach na hilde go Begin emmerlich, streak of a rabarst mood a chonrich, skachwood and torst me or demri, chitty machria for
So yeah, moving on. That's the first few verses, and the version that I'm working with is from the McLagan manuscripts in Glasgow, although it was taken down by Bridget Mackenzie in her Piping Traditions of the Northwest of Scotland. There's layers and layers to the poem, because there's the poem, there's the song that accompanies the poem, there's a pibroch that accompanies that, and then below that, I'll come to this later on, but I've kind of been playing with sort of reverse engineering counteroch gone to the pibroch, even though we don't necessarily have it in any of the counteroch sources. And yet, again, coming back to this kind of mutability of things, I was becoming interested in listening and thinking about whether, you know, when we play a piping song, I suppose with pibroch songs, pibroch poems, there's this relationship between being able to hear something musical with it, like non-verbal, and gain information. And I was kind of questioning, is there a chance, or is there a way of kind of theorizing the acquisition of, say, ecological environmental knowledge through listening to pipe music, or through learning counteroch? If the poems coming with it to some extent, you know, how do these different forms of or these different layers of the work translate into environmental knowledge. We've got 3 extant recordings on Pìobaire and Dall. They're all by William Matheson, and in each one he got the tune itself from John MacDonald of Hobick. And each one he only sings up to the moment when the pibroch starts. He doesn't sing the kind of the list of epithets, the molag that comes afterwards, but I'll come to that. In her piping traditions of the northwest of Scotland, Bridget Mackenzie suggests that the most sensible way to reorder this poem is to order it in terms of its relationship to the forms of the sort of stylistic form of pibroch. So she suggests that it's likely to have had a duis singling, a duis doubling, and then these first variations too, and that these might be reflected in the poetry. So here's just me trying to put together the relationships between these things. Here's the choire itself in the red circle. Both Mackenzie and Alec Haddo in his book on Cumha Choire have located it in relation to, you see Bealach and Féhe up in the top left here. Sorry, you can't see my mouse, but in the sort of middle left, and then also you can see the one of the lines talks about the pillars and the sunny are your pillars, O choire, and you can kind of see these rising pillars at the front of the choire too. And this, although it says here choire-eòlach, the sort of choire of the Catarach, it feeds down into Strath choire-eòlach down there. Moving on. Interestingly, Mackenzie notes that the change in acoustics of the sites might the site's acoustics have changed. So there's this kind of inherent conversation that occurs between the poet and the site, which is suggested might be related to Iain Dall's friend, the blind harper, Pìobaire Dall, who does the same in his Oren of MacAoidh. But Mackenzie kind of thinks maybe there's also something to do with this, the fact that the choire itself would have been a very sort of lively acoustic space, and that you would have heard an echo there in the past, although nowadays you're more likely to not, due to the fact that a tree plantation's been placed there. So there's this kind of changing acoustic ecology of the site that's been captured and talked about in time. Additionally, the site is in Elric, so it's it was likely used for hunting. And also this kind of Elric, the V shape that would be used for the deer drive, might have also provided a sort of good stage and a good sort of sounding place too for playing. So in the poem, it's acknowledged that Pìobaire Dall had played there, played a fáilte choire-eòlach, which is another pibroch altogether, but has relationships to the Lament for the Heart Tree. Yeah, moving on. So I've became interested in how drone might be explored in relation to all this, and how drone kind of produces blurry temporalities. Conscious of the time, so I'm gonna just hurry on a wee bit here. But yeah, safe to say there's something interesting in relation to the pipes and drone music generally, where there's a suspension of time. Yeah, kind of maybe has links to superhuman forms of listening. So we've got this example of messages being heard in Counterach, in Gaelic, but this kind of relates to the conversations earlier about a but I will move on and just talk about what I did with Counterach as opposed to that. So here's the original, well, here's the music that I'm working from, which is from Alan MacDonald's thesis. If there's any experts in counter-rock, I'd be grateful if you could tell me any mistakes that I've made. But I started trying to play with singing. Skip on for now, but I'm doing that with an electronic chanter that's MIDI controlling my voice. So I'm singing in one line, and then on the other one, I've got like auto tune. So I'm able to kind of play. I mean, I suppose we sing the pipes, shine your phoebe, but we play by playing it. I can harmonize and also kind of transpose certain embellishments and ornaments into my singing too, which has been quite an interesting thing. On another level, I started working with graphic scores, trying to develop different methods of notation using counter-rock to try and create improvisatory prompts while I'm playing. So here's a couple of early ones, which kind of draw on concrete poetry as much as graphic score traditions. Here we've got George Crumb's Macrocosmos on the right for piano and Gary Mackenzie's Bendoring too. And that started to lead to slightly more complex looking objects, which were really useful during performances, just as something to look at and try and orient myself towards. And then I started also trying to think about how poetry and the sort of counter-off might be transposed onto maps of the landscape to produce these slightly more complex. These are kind of ongoing, but I'm playing with them at the moment, so it's quite productive. Yeah, so I'm gonna try and I'm just play one more example, I think, and this is just the pìobaire, and then I'll probably stop there, so that we can have a bit of time for conversation.
Oh.
Sorry, I'll link it. I'll link it. Yeah, and just quickly some kind of final notes and recent things that I've been looking at is the Moloch as well. These kind of streams of epithets and adjectives, and one thing that I've noticed recently is there's a kind of in the Moloch there's a return to the urlar. It seems it's very hard to sing the Moloch the whole way through. All the adjectives are really difficult to move with pitch. But what I have realised, and I wonder if it's something to do with Iain Dall's training as a piper, he would have had counter-och from the McCrimmons, but whether there's a he quite often he goes like Tormanach, Oreganach, Alain, and there's this movement, and I think it's just because Gillespie is always like, you need to make more of that ein sort of sound. So I'm kind of constantly walking about going ein. But then this Tormanach, Oreganach, Alain with counter-och, a lot of the sort of inflection happens through mouth shape. You don't necessarily have to sing the notes. Well, at least from my understanding, I was Francis Boisman's done quite a lot of interesting research on that. But yeah, I wondered if like there's a sort of bit of a dialogue in the Muller between the return to the Urlar sung parts that are then followed by some chanting, and as well I know that like Ushdin has spoken before about the fact that he had Crossanach and Doyle is like a corruption of the poetic form of Crossanach. So this kind of the idea that you could have both chant. I know it's not necessarily a Crossanach at all, but the fact that there might be some singing and chanting in the same poem doesn't seem unlikely. But yeah, it's all very speculative. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at the moment in terms of research. And yeah, I'd love to hear any thoughts. Sorry, I've totally not left much time for chatting. But we had some technical hitches at the start, and then I got a bit stuck in the past. Made a bit nostalgic. But yeah, sorry. Thanks for listening.
Bíonn ach na tóise sin le taing gamat. Míle thanks on sin ba sin hóin parsing, doing. You've given something to everybody. I think there's been something for the artists, something for the pipers, something for the poets, and they're all with us. So I think let them get going. Sheibh ha leine hanech mi sheibh. So Matt, maybe could you turn off your presentation for the minute, and then it's a bit easier for me to see more faces on the screen. But if anybody who'd like to ask a question, there's a put your hand up thing at the bottom of the Zoom, or stick a question in the chat so that I can see you. Because if you wave at me in real life, I might not see you. And we'd be so interested to hear your thoughts, questions, points. Anybody in the room want to get started? Well,
I'd just say thanks very much, Mark Morantaink, and it's just great seeing both the visuals which you're creating, which is really interesting to see your concept of a score, and also I like the idea about how we can take Cumha Choire and Easa apart, and we can view it in different levels. Also, it's different genres. It's a sort of multi-genre experience, which I think is probably very true of the oral tradition as a whole. The fluidity between genres, and also almost how it's almost like you're saying the same message through different genres, but it's nuanced and inflected because of the genre which you're expressing it through. And it just shows that the extreme fluidity of communication on orality face to face is very interesting. Thank you.
I mean, even within just poetry itself, there's versions of it that you're always faced with that. But yeah, I mean, you start to branch out. I think that's why it's become such a behemoth of it. Like trying to get a leash on it. It's quite difficult. You're constantly thinking, I could bring this in, probably. Anyway.
But just really fascinating how just focus on those different aspects of things gives your audience in this case, but I mean other audiences and other readers, listeners, just an opportunity to concentrate on something that you don't catch otherwise. And I think it's a really valuable exercise. And, even for those of us who are traditional academics, just that sight through a different way of looking gives you this opportunity to notice something that you don't normally notice, or you don't notice it in that way. And it's really valuable to have us all sort of remember that we live in an oral world as well as a written world, and that spaces and sounds can be as important in catching our attention as anything else.
Yeah, I thought being a learner would be a real problem when starting the research, because I started in Cúrs Aontaigh at the start of the PhD, but actually, aside from the fact that you're trying to juggle all these different things, it's really interesting kind of getting to know something as you're trying to respond to it in that sense. And yeah, like I said, just about feeling things through your mouth, paying attention to making the right shape so it sounds good, and then going, actually, yeah, there's a relationship. At the start of the piece as well, where I was kind of doing the obair-taisbeanaidh, there I'd started to think, as I was doing all the adjectives at the end, this end of ach. I'm not saying that there's a relationship to the keening or to the obair-taisbeanaidh, but certainly the mouth shape is so similar that I was kind of interested in how you might start to just, I suppose it's the thing with sound, you can kind of put a couple of things on top of one another and then go, right, let's hear that relationship in real time. Let's hear it play out.
Yeah. But I was just going to say, it's fascinating that, when you're learning a language, you're sort of pitched into this new oral landscape that you have to make sense of. And it's something perhaps that we don't think about enough at Solmo Rustig. So maybe we should have more of a focus on that.
Yeah, how to listen.
How to listen as well as, yes.
Yeah. Meg, of course, h-eisimpleirean.
Hello, I really enjoyed that. You're being so imaginative and experimental, and it rang lots of bells. I thought I rather like what Abby's saying about the importance of sound. We've often seen the human shapes in the landscape with words like ceann and gúil and strawn. And you made me think about Easa, that it's not this rather unusual personification of the Choire, but when you're talking about the human voices in the landscape in any case. And I thought of a few others, and especially the interesting word maren, that kind of means a humming, and that the landscape, maybe from the water, makes a humming. Comes in yellow van, gliauntain and avarain, and lochs and bags and strawn. And I was thinking of other words like gúd and gurm, used of water, which are more normally human terms, and the word for the cave in Staffa, and nuav-vín, the sweet sounding.
Thinking about that and Wonder to the West.
Yes, and Maren is in there too. And I think the thing about the nettles at the end of a house is because of the uric acid from urine, from people going to pee at the end of the house. So good luck with this work. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and Biela, anyone else want to chip in? Very had camera go on. h-eisimpleirean. Oh no, Gallaby.
Drew me a foot and Ciarishin, but I won't actually get started because otherwise I won't stop. But I just wanted to say that was Muirvadach Vaidach Erach go ma. So thank you very much. Really, really interesting. Lots of things. Like Meg says, kind of sparking off similarities and resonances across lots of different people's creative practice in place-based ways.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've just
Hello. Thank you so much. That was just superb. Having been taught pibroch in the old days, I was always rather concerned that we couldn't go with the music at all. You just had to play it against a formula, which was set right across the board, whatever the subject, more or less, whatever the class of pibroch it was, whether salute or gathering or lament, or and it seemed strange to me. And it's only, well, I was asked by Alan MacDonald to help him with one of his modules at the RSND, RCS, and I was asked to speak about the so-called dynasties, the different piping families, and but all I had to go on was what had been sold to us for 200 years, and it was beginning to feel dissatisfied with that, and drilling down into the separate family histories, that so much emerged which was to do with group and group activity and commonality, as opposed to the autonomous skill sets of the different families and so on. So I came to Iain Dall fairly late in the day, and was just fascinated to realize a huge entry in Saropen and bhàrd Gaelic, and you know, a career as a poet in every sense of the word, and how this had been completely, more or less completely closed off from the world of piping, underlying that disassociation or loss of Gaelic within piping. And everything that flowed from that was, everything was fascinating, just as you're taking it so much further on, and this experimentation with sound is superb. And I think anyone who's lived with the sound of drones for many years is always captivated by that, and the locking in of the frequencies and how they work, and the tension between bass and tenors, and one of the strange initiatory talks that you're given when you're learning pipes is that the pipe started off with one drone, then they were given another drone, and then they were given a bass drone. And it was only after kind of 100 years of listening and thinking about this that I realized that that was just nonsense, you know. And if anything, it started with the bass drone, because of the extraordinary power of the bass drone and the complexity of its frequencies, and the amazing magic when that locks into the notes of the chanter. And anyway, and you mentioned just at the end the Crosnach and Dói, and my particular, excuse me, feeling that in order just to attack this subject, just to make a nonsense of what the Pibroch Society had published so many years ago, with this great banner across the top of it, the blind piper's obstinacy. And I felt myself that obstinacy was the last possible emotion that Iain Dall ever had. And that in fact it was, one might translate the Crosnach and Dóil as the contention of the blind poet or something, because it does fit in with the dialogue or conversational mode and model. So anyway, just I mustn't go on, because we could talk about Iain Dall all day.
Yeah.
I happened to be talking about him to RCS students yesterday, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. But thank you very much.
Well,
It'd be
thank you.
good to meet up at some point. I'm more in Edinburgh at the moment, so it'd be good to meet up in Edinburgh.
Yeah, I'll get your email. That'd be lovely.
Yeah, will do. Yeah. Okay. Time for
And Lord.
Kate.
Lovely. Yeah, Kate, fel ysyn sin eisiau bio, mae'n gwybod. Blue has down. Oh, stoch can be lovely message from Kate. Just as she left, saying, "Chord children, Blan Hain, Tango, and Matt, your approach takes us into much more expansive, imaginative possibilities. Very cool." And wasn't it just? Um,
Um,
yeah, no, before we started, Matt was saying, oh, does everybody need cheering up? No, I'm sure they don't need cheering up. And I said, no, we do need cheering up. It's cold here and winter's starting, and this is exactly what we need to remind us that there's a world out there to experience in different ways. Do you spiel ein Linus on?
Ha
Ceis
ceis
Daniel?
Jacob's ile actually.
Yeah, go for it. Go for
Just
it.
wanted to ask, how do we stay in touch with seeing how this project progresses for you, Matt?
That's a great question. I'm terrible at self-promotion. But yeah, I will make sure that I circulate any sort of forthcoming performances with folks at SMO, I suppose, might be a good way to do that. And also, I mean, I'm supposed to be coming up to do a performance of the Waterfall Laments. Unfortunately, family things didn't permit that, but hopefully we'll be able to schedule that for at some point next year, and come up and do a bit of a performance and talk a bit more, or have a bit more of a sort of casual chat about the work and what other people are doing, of course.
Oh, Mary, if we could schedule that at a time when you were due to be over, that sounds like that would work very well. I mean, it just in how the project progresses. Follow-on question. I had one purely from the practical end of thinking about how performance practice research works. You may know this yet because you're not far enough on into thinking about what the final shape of the PhD will be like. But I just had, I was wondering what you think the balance is going to be in terms of pieces of art, pieces of sound, film, and pieces of writing. Do you know yet how that's going to shake down in terms of how much of what you eventually call the project is going to be interesting artwork and how much has got to be writing?
Well, we've got with ECA, you've got your predefined 50,000 words, which just feels like not very much when you've got a lot that you want to write about. And yeah, I suppose it's there's three, so between the Waterfall Laments, the Farewell to the Familiar Earth, and then the next project that I'm kind of starting to work on now, which is primarily concerned with hunting and histories of hunting and land use. I think those three will just kind of have to sit alongside each other. They're all kind of, the hard thing is when these things start to, as you might expect, overlap, and you're kind of trying to write about. I think there's a temptation with practical work to write about making something, and that can isolate things from one another, when actually maybe there's something more to be said, or certainly the angle that I'm more interested in writing about making is making across the different projects, and maybe the kind of the writing across the kind of betweenness of these things, as it were. That's kind of what I'm at, I suppose. Although it would be a lot easier if I just said, I made this on this machine and here's the diagram. But it kind of feels like then you're not engaging the kind of critical discourses that, I mean, it's through writing, through thinking, how can I listen, through use someone like Stephen Feld's approach to listening, to hearing. How can I then do we have that in Gaelic culture? Is it have something similar to that? Through that's where the work arises. So kind of.
It's funny, isn't it? Because you're having to cue people up to be able to experience the music or the visual imagery, and different audiences need cued up in different ways. So it's a real it's really interesting, but a real challenge. It's trying to think about how you.
What do you need to tell them or not tell them? Yeah. I know that's it, and I suppose the one of the interesting things is when it comes to the final, when it comes to the Viva, that who's going to be examining, because if you've written something and you have a Gaelic scholar, then they're going to need a completely different thesis to an artist in a way, because those kind of cues, well, not necessarily, but you almost, don't know, that maybe that's the thing. It's finding that sweet spot in the middle where it speaks to everyone.
I think that's always the hard challenge with any interdisciplinary project, isn't it? But also so worthwhile.
Yeah, totally. That's what's exciting about it.
H-eisimpleirean. We didn't speak. Well, just mila tang matarish tang board. That was really, it was a wonderful way to spend Wednesday lunchtime, and really exciting to hear about what you're up to, and we'll all keep an eye on what's coming. So thanks so much again, and yeah, we'll get you up, and we'll hear it all in real life. Once things settle down a bit at home, it'd be lovely.
Yeah, great.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Wow.
Thanks for coming. Lovely to see you.